with WSP. We are one of the largest multidisciplinary engineering firms. So we support projects throughout the life cycle. So we start from the very beginning with advisory services, environmental permitting and planning, all the way through engineering and delivering projects. So my personal background is actually planning. I've been working in renewable energy and transmission work for over 10 years, mainly in California, but also throughout the country. So I'm really excited to be part of this panel here talking about transmission. We're going to start just with a quick round of introductions in each of our relationship to transmission and the work here in California, and then we'll get started. Hey, Arnie, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Hi. Happy to be here. My name's Arnie Jacobson. I'm director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, and we've been involved in analysis of transmission for offshore wind for dating back to about 2018, and then currently involved in a multi-state study that's looking at both Southern Oregon and Northern California together.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Travis DeVille, and I hail from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, where I'm the Wind Energy Grid Integration Portfolio Manager. And I work as part of a larger team of power systems modelers, production cost modelers, data scientists, who have studied the integration of offshore wind on the Atlantic and also the Pacific coast, the West Coast, over several studies recently in recent years. Quickly, PNL is one of 17 national laboratories, and our core focuses are in national defense, national security, fundamental scientific discovery, and power grid operations. So those are our three major focus areas, and look forward to talk to you today about this fascinating problem.
Good afternoon. I'm Neil Miller, VP of Infrastructure and Operations Planning at the California Independent System Operator. One of our core jobs that most people are familiar with is operating the electricity market for about 80% of California, and we also operate an imbalance market over 80% of the Western Interconnect. My division's responsible for, among other things, leading the transmission planning process for the roughly 80% of the state that's in our footprint.
Great, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to just bring up, we would love to take any questions throughout the session, answer your questions, so please feel free to go into the app. If you click on this session, you'll see the spot you can answer, put in any of your questions, and then we'll be able to see them up here. So we'll try to weave that into the discussion. So please feel free to provide any questions. So to get started, transmission infrastructure is a key component for bringing energy from offshore wind projects onshore to the load centers. There's two potential points of interconnection to integrate offshore wind resources. In the Central Coast, there's estimates of 5 to 6 gigawatts of capacity to be available. But then also on the North Coast, California's North Coast, there's very little transmission infrastructure exists. So I thought what we could do is just to start with setting the stage. So maybe we can start with what are some of the challenges and opportunities in the North and Central Coasts, respectively.
Happy to start, and maybe I'll just first note that on the screen you'll see that we've included a map of the transmission system for California and Oregon, and that's just to give a reference point so people can see what the existing infrastructure looks like. In the context of doing that, we've shown lines that are higher voltage and higher capacity being somewhat thicker, and those that are smaller being thinner, so you can get a sense of what that infrastructure looks like. And then we've color-coded by the owner of that transmission. So the blue is Pacific Gas and Electric, the red is Pacific Power, and the cyan or purplish color is Bonneville, and then everybody else's we showed in a sort of a darker color. And so that just gives a sense of what things look like, and we've also shown the wind areas that have been designated so far by BOEM and the offshore bathymetry. Just a shout out to a couple of students from Cal Poly Humboldt who have been involved in our our wind work who are here today, Claire Ingvoldsen and Donovan Wakeman, and in particular, Donovan played a leading role in developing the map. So big thanks to them. So in terms of challenges in association with transmission, of course, what's the story on the Central Coast is very different from the story on the North Coast. The work we've been doing is focused much more on the North Coast, so I'll speak to that briefly. I think the short story is that the transmission infrastructure in northwestern California, and actually in lots of southern Oregon as well, is really designed just to provide power from the Central Valley or the I-5 corridor out to the coast to serve relatively small communities with relatively small loads. And so it's not really infrastructure that's designed to bring large amounts of power from the coast inland. It's just, it's designed to meet what it has historically been designed to do. And so as offshore wind develops, there's of course a need to build out that transmission infrastructure in order to be able to deliver that power to markets. And these are, they're relatively remote, rugged country that has to be crossed. So for overland routes, there are a number of challenges associated with rights of way existing rights of way are relatively small compared to what would be needed. The terrain is rugged. There's a lot of fire risk in these regions. So yeah, there's some challenges. And then if you're looking at undersea offshore transmission, I think there's some real interesting possibilities there, but also a number of challenges associated with the bathymetry and being able to find routes to move power, especially towards the south and towards the Bay Area, and then bring it back on shore. I'll just pause and see if anyone else wants to add to that.
Oh, I think that was a really good overview. I would just add that, not surprisingly for the North Coast area, it's not starting with a clean slate, but it's pretty close. Serving 80, 100 megawatts of load. Obviously, the transmission system never envisioned managing several thousand megawatts of offshore wind needing to be brought onto the coast and then evacuated down to serve load centers in other parts of the state. With the, as Arnie mentioned, the Central Coast area, much different. We've been communicating for a number of years now that the transmission grid there, based on the redundancy that was required around the nuclear power plant, the transmission system there could accommodate up to 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind coming out to land before Diablo retires, and move that up to 5,000 after. Of course, then someone had to say 6, which would just push us into the next upgrade. But a relatively robust system there is a good starting point, but obviously a lot of attention needs to be put into what to do about the North Coast area.
And one of the other things I know we were talking about too were, what are some of the, in terms of opportunities, where are some of the lessons learned from the East Coast or other renewable energy type of planning processes that could be brought here?
Yeah, and that's the great news, right? That we don't have to go first. It's a different context, of course. So there are some things that apply, and maybe others don't apply quite as much. But one of the major learnings so far from the East Coast activity, and I've been associated with this on assignment directly to Department of Energy. I'm now back to the laboratory full time, but in that time, over the last 2 years or so, what we have learned is that there's great power in bringing the states together. So one of the major levers for impact seems to be to get the states, multi-state transmission planning collaboratives, and that there already are models of such things in play right now, and folks might be familiar with the New England States Transmission Initiative, which is showing real promise. And the idea here is that states can come together and develop a shared transmission plan that serves all of their needs at the state level. Also allows them to consider how they might provide a consolidated input to the system operators, the transmission system operators, for how that system should evolve. There's also the advantages of this are also to consider how it kind of paves the way for the changes that need to happen across the states consistently in terms of regulations and procurement processes, solicitations. If they're all aligned, things go smoother. And this all kind of lays the foundation for cost allocation, which is sort of one of the major issues. Maybe it's simpler in California with CAISO, one ISO, one state, but it gets more complicated and the reason why I'm on the panel today, when we think about the larger region, we think about multiple states, multiple transmission operators. So these steps seem to be gaining traction on the Atlantic coast, and they do apply here on the West Coast, I would say. There are other technical lessons learned. I don't know that I won't spend too much time there, but certainly some of the NERC standards they could be clarified. So one of the recommendations that we are making is that there should be a clarification of some of the NERC standards in terms of how they apply to subsea cables, for example, in terms of credible multiple contingencies. That's one very specific area. There are other sources of clarification that would also benefit the West Coast. And then finally, I'll just point to the technology standards, kind of collapsing towards a set of topologies that the industry can run with, and kind of recommending and aligning on what those should be. And then HVDC is obviously a huge piece of the future of this industry and this opportunity on every coastline, and particularly on the West Coast. And we have a great heritage of HVDC, some of the oldest HVDC projects in the United States, right? So I think the idea of a center of excellence, a way to there's a lot of thought around simulations of multiple converter systems. There's a lot to be developed there and understood. There's a lot of development required to unlock the potential benefits of high voltage direct current transmission.
No, and in terms of taking some of those potential opportunities, Arnie or Neil, are there any specific that you're hearing that would be very relevant to California?
Not so much thinking about learnings from the East Coast in relationship to California, but I think one thing that is really to think through is the difference between what's happening on the East Coast and what's happening on the West Coast, and how that relates to transmission technology and infrastructure. One of the big differences is that on the East Coast, at least so far, a lot of the wind infrastructure has been in shallower water, where you have fixed foundation wind farms, but that also means you can have fixed foundation transmission infrastructure or offshore substations. That won't be the case likely here, or at least not within the wind areas themselves, because the water is so much deeper. And so there's some real technology challenges, I think, associated with floating substations, and particularly floating high voltage DC conversion stations, technologies that are not yet developed, but which would be quite relevant to being able to build out infrastructure most effectively. And I think there are also issues associated with the availability of dynamic high voltage DC cables that are able to operate at the water depths that are in question. And so there is a real need for innovation and technology development in order to eventually develop the ideal transmission infrastructure for offshore wind on the Pacific coast.
Yeah, and I'd just add, I think quite often we're always concerned that sometimes we hear the part about being different in the West at times perhaps gets overplayed, but here the nature of the resource really does shift this to a much different conversation. As opposed to a larger number of smaller farms that can locate along the coast, perhaps multiple smaller injection points along the way, we really do see this as a case of, because of the sheer scale that's necessary to support the supply chains that we heard about through the rest of the conference, the resource really does need to come on with a material amount of resource in order to be cost effective from the beginning. And that also then drives much higher requirements for the amount that the grid can absorb from that system when it comes on. And also the distances further ashore as well also suggests that different types of technologies should be used to bring the power ashore in the first place. So as opposed to having a large number of potential injection points onto the rest of the grid, we see a relatively small number, but of very large injection points for when those resources come ashore.
Great. So, I mean, in terms of, also, we were talking about expanding on opportunities, and there are kind of several themes that we were talking about before the conference. One of them, specific in the California context, is about planning and process improvements in California. I know the state transmission planning is accomplished through the CPUC Integrated Resource Plan, known as the IRP, and the CAISO Transmission Planning Process, the TPP. So what are some of the opportunities for process improvement for long lead time resources?
Well, it's Neil, I'll jump in first on that. So we've been really valuing the good working relationship we have with the state agencies responsible for both the load forecasting through the California Energy Commission and the resource planning led through the Public Utilities Commission's integrated resource planning process. So that's where we've been taking all of our signals for the major, and this is where it actually helps this conversation in particular, for the major transmission on the main backbone, and that's the kind of transmission we're talking about here. So I believe, as Luan mentioned earlier this morning about the portfolios, the resource plans that the CPUC has been developing, we've been taking this issue very seriously for a number of years, studying a range of sensitivities and different options, really trying to flesh out what kind of options are available to us. But even in the transmission plan that we're taking to our board for approval next week, there was a relatively small amount of offshore wind identified in the North Coast that really wouldn't drive any upgrades. But the sensitivity cases we studied, as well as what we already know will be our planning cases for next year, are calling for a material amount of North Coast offshore wind that will drive that first wave. So while we've been studying different alternatives for a number of years, now it's time to get real on the sequencing and which is the first development that should actually move forward. And that's something we'll be working on through the rest of the year. When you mention other process improvements, it's true that a lot of the interstate coordination on transmission planning, which is under federal jurisdiction, has been a bit bumpy over the years. And while there's a federally mandated process in place right now for information sharing, it hasn't been terribly effective at actually getting people to the table and getting good coordination going. What we've been doing is trying to identify up front what we see needed to meet the California requirements, and then using that as a starting point for discussions about other potential opportunities to partner up with neighbors, do better, but by already having identified, here's what we would need. And our best articulation of that was put out last May as a 20-year outlook, mapping out a broader grid perspective that included offshore wind, out-of-state wind, as well as the massive amount of in-state resources that also have to be developed.
And kind of thinking about those next steps too, in terms of offshore wind lease sales, can kind of the next rounds of staging for projects be incorporated in transmission planning now, like you were just saying? Was that part of that planning process too?
That's part of that. A year from now, all things being equal with what we know today, we'll be moving forward to ask for approval for the first wave of transmission to access North Coast wind.
So one of the other questions that we were talking about too, related to planning and process improvements, how can process improvements for deliverability rights and interconnection queues expedite offshore wind interconnection?
Oh, I think that's coming my way. Well, sorry. With offshore wind, we do see it being a little different here because right now the ISO we are having to deal with across the entire state a massive number of new projects applying for interconnection. And when we're talking about quantities, just to put it in perspective, before April, we already had 180,000 megawatts of resources in our interconnection process. working through, wanting to get detailed results so that they could then compete with the load-serving entities for a contract, for a PPA to move forward with their project. In April, we received another 541 completed applications, totaling another 354,000 megawatts of installed capacity. So when people say there's no transmission, what they normally mean is we've applied at the end of a very long list of people ahead of us. There is capacity across the state. We are adding more. Obviously, we need to add a lot more transmission to meet these clean energy goals. But the reality is there's also an overabundance of projects applying compared to the amount of contracting that will actually take place. We definitely need to get that house in order. And we are working through a stakeholder process right now looking at much larger, more foundational changes to our interconnection process to manage that. But when it comes to offshore wind, we're not expecting to see that level of over-competition for interconnection requests. Now that it's becoming real with leases going out, leases being purchased, we're expecting the applications to be much more limited to the people that are actually, that have a lease and that are moving forward with their interconnections, as opposed to having this large volume of overheated supply. So I honestly don't see the queue issues that are getting attention for a lot of other resources, batteries in particular, being quite the same issue here. We'll be expecting to see very quickly that we deal with a smaller number of projects that are very serious, that have put serious money into these leases and are able to focus on those. And they're all connecting more or less in the same geographic areas as well.
Oh, great, thank you. Go ahead, Arnie.
Yeah, and I just circling back to the staging question and sort of can the next stage of offshore wind projects be considered in the transmission planning process? Some of the analysis that we're involved in, and also some of the work that Travis and colleagues are involved in, is I think trying to think about that. So currently, the Humboldt wind energy area in the northern part of California is the only wind area that's been designated, but we would anticipate that additional wind energy areas may be identified, perhaps offshore from Crescent City or Del Norte County, for example. And so we are going through an analytical process to try and understand what are the transmission needs at a few different sizes of offshore wind development that could occur over the next couple of decades, and what sorts of trade-offs and choices are there between what you do early and what you do later, and that kind of analysis I think can feed into that kind of planning process. So there is certainly some thinking that we're doing, and others from state agencies and PNNL and others, as well as the utilities, are involved in those conversations. One of the really important things I think we need to think about as we do that, part of the story is how do we move power from offshore wind farms to large load centers that are able to absorb that power. But I think there's also a really important complementary question, which is how do we make sure that coastal communities and communities along the transmission routes are also receiving benefits from reliability benefits and other benefits from that transmission development and from the offshore wind development itself. And so that also needs to be included in the planning process and thought about all along the way, because obviously the communities that are closest to the wind development may be relatively small from a load perspective, but are also, I think, rightly expecting to benefit from an electricity perspective and in other ways from that development.
Well, we have a question that came in, so I think it's along the same theme of talking about planning and process and regulation. So one of the questions that came in from the audience, can you discuss regulatory challenges of landing transmission in Oregon? So Travis, I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
It's a great question. It's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse because it's land use, it's landing cables. I believe the question is focused on landing points. Transmission is planned by the major transmission operators, rolled up through Northern Grid. So there's a process similar to what Neil has spoken to with CAISO's process, but it's different, of course. And then, so transmission is planned at the Northern Grid level, and then goes to approval by the PUC as well. In Oregon, land use is different. There's an Oregon Department of Land Use, Conservation, and Development that is quite active and has a sophisticated plan for how the Oregon lands can be accessed. But I'm sorry that I can't quite answer that question in full. I need Andy Lanier from ODCLD here in the room. But there are others. So maybe if you follow me after the session, I can connect you to others who would maybe know that answer better.
All right. Well, I also want to bring up another topic, another theme, and I think we already started touching upon this a little bit earlier in the discussion, but it's around technology, and I think this is a really interesting one, specifically for the California context and when we're thinking about transmission solutions. So what role might undersea cables play to mitigate land-based constraints to deliver power to the coastal load centers?
I think as we've looked at a number of different transmission alternatives at a few different scales of development, and it seems pretty clear that most solutions are going to probably involve a combination of overland transmission and offshore transmission or undersea transmission. And so very much see undersea transmission playing an important role. We would expect that to be, at least for significant distances, to be high voltage DC undersea transmission. And there are ways of doing that now, but there are some technology developments that we would anticipate happening that might make that more effective maybe a decade out or so. And so that's something I think that needs to be followed quite carefully, and I think in addition, just really making sure that it's clear that there is demand for these technology advances so that industry is able to meet some of the needs associated with advances in high voltage DC undersea cables that are able to operate it in the conditions that we're expecting here on the Pacific coast, as well as for offshore conversion stations and other similar technologies.
And I'll just add that equally important to understanding how the technology will work is what it will cost. We are about to launch the West Coast Offshore Wind Transmission Study, a federal study, Department of Energy study, led by PNNL and NREL, launching just next week. So hopefully some of you in the room are on that kickoff on Tuesday. If so, I will see you there. One of the core sub-tasks early on in that project is to go engage with industry, and specifically those working in the subsea transmission part of the sector, and specifically focusing on floating offshore wind transmission costs. So what do these cables cost? What are these, what would we assume that's realistic from a floating, offshore substation? I mean, that's kind of a crazy idea when I tell people who aren't in this room that I utter those words and they say, we're going to have a substation float. And maybe if you come from oil and gas, it's not so intimidating, but that is, we don't have a good sense. I do not have a good sense for what those costs, what realistic cost assumptions are for those. Maybe others of you in the room do, but maybe that's part of the task, Arnie.
Yeah, and then as part of the options that we've been looking at for a number of years, subsea cables, our working assumption to this point has always been that the offshore wind developers get the power ashore, and then we're taking it from there and integrating it the rest of the way into the grid. But even in that context, we've been looking at various AC, DC overland alternatives, as well as HVDC submarine cable as a real potential option. That same technology has been getting looked at for other potential applications in our transmission plan. So I think for us, it's a matter of, we just see it as a matter of time that there will be coastal subsea transmission used as a way to help move some power up and down the coast, and also address some of the other challenges with getting transmission built. So I think it's more a case of what application goes first as opposed to if. But then when you move it to the complexity of using HVDC, either as a way to bring the power ashore or to build an offshore network as a collector system, that really ratchets up the complications. And I'm hearing ideas for offshore floating substations. I'm hearing anchored on the sea floor. We're hearing a lot of different ideas, but that's a moving target right now on the technology side.
I think it's a really exciting discussion and topic for sure to follow over the next couple of years to see how this is going to evolve and what comes first, like you were saying. Another theme that comes along with, I think, offshore wind and transmission kind of overall, Arnie, you brought this up too a little bit earlier, is community benefits. So considering community benefits as a key overall pathway for offshore wind development. I know this has come up. It's interesting to see how kind of the topic gets intertwined with various planning initiatives. I work on the Atlantic side as well, and recently working in Atlantic City, more on a resiliency type of project, looking at coastal resiliency measures going out 50 years, and that topic became intertwined with community benefits related to offshore wind that's occurring on the Atlantic seaboard. The interconnection, how do you tie that into O&M and the port facilities, such as Atlantic City has O&M facilities for ports in a very established community right alongside the ports. So again, just a lot of topics and themes coming together around community benefits. So in this context around transmission, what are some opportunities for workforce, labor, and local economic development to support transmission build-out?
Well, I think one of the areas to think about here is just the electricity reliability dimension. A lot of the coastal communities do have concerns about electricity reliability and would like to see improvements in that regard. And I think there are real possibilities there, but there are also some trade-offs with technology choice and how the system architecture is set up that have to be thought through. If you typically with a high voltage DC line, you're wanting to move a lot of power from one point to another point without very many off ramps, and obviously, in order to provide electricity benefits to some of the smaller communities along the coast and along the route, you do need those interconnection points in order to be able to provide those benefits. And so, I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into how exactly to design those things so that those benefits do accrue. Certainly, workforce and job-related benefits are another part of the story, and laying the groundwork for building as much high-paying, what we would call high-road jobs, job opportunities, so that they accrue within the West Coast more broadly, but in particular in some of the communities that are close to the areas where the developments are happening. Some of the skills that are needed for developing transmission are fairly technical and high skilled, but there are also many more general construction and skill sets that are more widely available, but nonetheless training is needed to lay the groundwork for all of that to work.
It's an interesting wrinkle to the transmission planning problem. I think it's just different now. Neil, you've got the history, but it seems to me like this is a new challenge that maybe we haven't had we haven't taken full advantage of. And it's an opportunity. Every challenge is an opportunity. We haven't taken full advantage of it, but now it is different now. I think the studies that Arnie's referring to, the work in the West Coast offshore wind transmission study, we have a separate task. It's really new. It's a new wrinkle. It's trying to link ecological impact to social impact and identify, run a benefit cost trade-off based on that linkage. And that's a totally new thing for us. And we've never done something like that before. We think it's time for it, and we're excited to put that in play.
Yes, and besides the transmission needed to actually move these large volumes of offshore wind, this is obviously also going to drive up other electricity loads in the area. So part of the overall planning for this can't just focus on what it takes to get the offshore power out onto the grid into major load centers for those volumes. It's also what do we need to do to support the rest of what's going to be taking off for load growth in many of these areas. There's a reason those transmission systems haven't changed for many years, and it's because there was virtually no load growth driving any upgrades, this is going to happen, and this is going to need to be something we take into account in our overall planning.
And we do have a couple more questions that have come in from the audience. So I will kind of read a couple of those out. We'll see if we can answer them up here. The first one being, with the 4 most northern counties in California lying outside the CAISO balancing area, is there a plan to kind of address this misalignment?
I won't be able to speak to a plan to address that, but I will say, just as a point of clarification more broadly, is that the Humboldt County is part of the CAISO balancing area, and so offshore wind brought to shore from the Humboldt wind energy area would be within the balancing area. But if there were a future offshore wind farm developed, for example, off of Del Norte County, Pacific Power, which is not part of the CAISO balancing area, is who serves that, and I think that's what the question is getting at. Maybe I'll pass things over to Neil in terms of whether or not there's any thought in relationship to that question.
Well, I think for us it boils down to the 2 different issues, as I mentioned. One is about moving the large volumes of power. There we have been having, even though I saw there was another question about FERC Order 1000, and FERC Order 1000 is what established this interregional coordination process that had some data sharing, but as a venue for actually discussing and moving forward on transmission projects, it proved not to be a good way to try to get anything actually done. So there, the discussions have been more occurring just offline. So we do have excellent working relationships with our neighbors, so we would be looking to coordinate with them on how best to meet those needs if they're not within one footprint or the other. And we do see that coordination being needed. We know who to call, but it's a case of just getting those conversations going and working out, really, once we all have a better handle on what it is we're dealing with. And I think for us, that's always been the most important issue. We have a number of alternatives. The question for us is what volume are we dealing with? What's the pace of that development? And that would allow us to do the sequencing more effectively. So, we could do this better or worse depending on how well we understand the sequencing of the resource development, the volumes, and the timing, and then get our own alternatives and have the time to coordinate with our neighbors to come up with the best overall sequence of events. This isn't a case of one big project taking care of it. This is a lot of alternatives will be needed. How do we pace them? How do we sequence them? Those are the big conversations for us going forward.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, kind of you're talking about sequencing, kind of the coordination, regionally, I'm kind of thinking a little bit about stakeholder and public engagement as a piece of that too. Are there, any recommendations that come to mind, related to transmission projects? Obviously, through the environmental planning process, there's engagement there and there's opportunities there. But in terms of the, working through the sequencing and the regional coordination, is there, additional thoughts that you may have related to kind of public engagement?
I'll just start by saying I think that public engagement is critically important, and permitting large transmission projects is not an easy thing, and I think beginning to socialize alternatives and options early and getting input in relationship to them at an earlier stage perhaps than is often done is something that I think would be done right, could be really beneficial.
Yes, and I think, most of the problems associated with community acceptance around major transmission, by definition, most of the people seeing a transmission line, seeing it go by them, and the perception is that it's going to serve someone at the other end. So what's it doing for them? So in this work, it's going to be critical that the local communities are truly being folded into the overall benefits, because we can't access these renewables and everything that goes with it without the transmission to support it. So we really do need to do a better job tying, the benefits with the impacts, and engaging with the communities as early as possible about the total picture, so that it's not just viewed as well, we like the offshore wind, we like the development, we like the employment, but we're going to fight the transmission line. Well, that's kind of key to getting the whole thing working. So we have to do a better job of integrating those issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's a key component to the whole package. So
Yeah.
be able to communicate that. We have a couple more questions that have come in. I think we talked about the FERC 1000 already, but the next one is in procurement, and it's kind of related to being, in central or otherwise, a critical path for offshore transmission as it is for development of the lease areas.
Well, we see the procurement being a very big deal. That in order for the Public Utilities Commission to be having the comfort to getting us going on pulling the trigger, moving forward on some major transmission efforts, that for that to happen, there has to be the comfort that there is a viable path for procurement for that volume. So yes, we've seen that as one of the issues that has to be addressed up front. We have this first wave coming through the plans provided to us for next year's transmission plan, but to go beyond that, the procurement issue will have to be addressed.
I think we have one more, and one of the questions is, can you talk about offshore network grid possibilities and benefits, like moving power from other sources to load and wildfire resilience?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's, there certainly are benefits. The question is, at what cost? But we have modeled that, and we are modeling that currently. Offshore transmission, coordinated offshore transmission with bidirectional flows on a backbone. If, under a resilience event, not so dissimilar from the bootleg fire, which caused arcing on the California-Oregon intertie, and subsequently led to BPA de-energizing the Pacific DC intertie in the middle of a heat wave when California needed lots of power and lost 5,500 megawatts of import capacity. Maybe Neil remembers that day, I don't know.
Yep.
That is the kind of event in which an offshore wind transmission network could be interregional, could be quite valuable. The question is how, at what cost? And I hate to keep coming back to the cost, but there's just so much technology maturity that needs to happen. It's very exciting to think about, alternatives to Pacific DC intertie and balancing the interties that we have today, and permitting even more north-south transfers of clean electrons in the future through offshore transmission. That gets me really excited. I do have to kind of pump the brakes and think about what the cost will be of that technology.
And I think to that end, some of the analysis, both that Travis and team are doing and that we're doing, will provide information about what those costs might look like. Mm-hmm. And so it's meant to inform that. We're in the middle of doing analysis of about 10 different transmission alternatives across multiple scales of offshore wind development, looking from everything from about 7 gigawatts between Oregon and Northern California up to about 25 gigawatts. And we'll be presenting preliminary results from some of that work at a CEC hosted AB 525 webinar, which I believe is scheduled for May 25th, but pay attention to the CEC website for those details. And so I think there will be some of this information coming out soon that will speak to some of these questions.
Yes, and I think for us, though, when we see the idea of the offshore network grid, that still looks like it's largely a collector systems within each of those various call areas, within the North Coast area or the Central Coast areas being quite geographically distinct. Whether those networks help with the local issues, that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity. Sooner or later, though, we need some long-haul transmission to get that power down to the major load centers. That goes beyond the geography bounded by the individual call areas themselves. So that's where we see some possibilities, but sooner or later we also need the long-haul transmission to get to the major load centers.
I think we're just about at time. I had just one last quick question to end on, kind of like with all the topics we were talking about here today related to transmission. We know it's a key piece for the whole package for offshore wind. For each of you, what is in terms of next steps in the short term, what do you think is, the most critical next step?
Well, I think we've been doing quite a bit of analysis to try and understand transmission needs for different offshore wind development scenarios. And I think the next step after that analysis is really starting to look at specific routes, rights of way, permitting, and really just trying to understand some of the nuts and bolts of how some of these alternatives or the more promising of these alternatives might make it to the next stage.
For me, it's states coming together. So the question before, how are they planning up in those counties north of the CAISO border? That's Pacific Core territory. Pacific Core is running their own planning process. Bonneville is running their own planning process for offshore wind. And it's really the states coming together that can kind of glue everything and bring everybody together. So I'm going to keep hitting the state drum as long as I can.
And for us at the CAISO, Jeff Billington, our Director of Infrastructure Planning, and Ibrahim Rahimi, who I believe was also able to make it here today, our Senior Advisor. For them, now that we've got the CPUC portfolios that are calling for accommodating at least up to 1,500 or 1,600 megawatts of North Coast wind in next year's transmission plan, that for us is now our signal to get going. This isn't a study exercise anymore. Now it's real on moving on what the best alternatives are. So this is us having to kick into gear and escalating those conversations about narrowing down what's the first set of alternatives we actually move on to access these resources.
Great. Well, I think we're at time, but we actually got to pick the music coming out here, right? So let's get it started was the choice. So I think we're ready. I think this was a great discussion. I want to thank all the panelists today, spending the time, bringing their expertise to share with everyone today. So thank you for joining us.